be to God. At least that's what we say this morning, thanks be to God. I'm not sure that's what the lame man said. That's quite a story, you know. The whole story centers around the question. Jesus was famous for asking questions. Sometimes when you're laid up with the flu or you break your leg skiing or something like that, just read through the gospel accounts and make a list of all the questions that Jesus asked, because questions are tremendous teaching tools, as you know, but they're also ways of digging into people's defenses. And some questions that Jesus asked are hard to avoid. They step out of the mist. They stand in our way. They refuse to move to one side or the other, and they become so big that we cannot get around them. Here's one. Do you want to be healed? The question was directed to a paralytic in Jerusalem. The man had been paralyzed for 38 years. Do we have anybody in the congregation this morning who's 38 years old? Anybody in the congregation beyond 30? Oh, no. This man lay alongside a pool in Jerusalem that supposedly had miraculous power. People said, and legend said, that periodically an angel troubled the waters. You know, the wind probably blew. And whoever stepped into this pool first was healed by the troubling of the waters, the stirring of the waters. Well, that's one thing to deal with, part of the story. The other part of the story, it's kind of like a soap opera story. Really, it is like a soap opera story, because this man never made it into the pool and had invested all of his hope for a better life in this rumor, shall we say. He never made it. I love the way Doc read it. She picked up the nuance of the story. Day after day, for 38 years, someone always beat him into the pool. 38 years. You'd have thought that there'd have been one day when it rained so bad or the sun was so hot that everybody else didn't show up. But no, that's this man's claim. Anyway, his claim. Who wouldn't want to be healed? Do you ever ask a starving person if they want a meal? Do you ever ask a pauper if he or she needs money? If the question is so self-evident that it is ridiculous, why does it seem so important in the story and to us? Why is it a question to me and not only to a paralytic? Why is it a question for this church to think about? Every detail of this story reeks with importance. Jesus comes upon the scene. It's a Saturday, evidently. What's he doing out on a Saturday anyway? As a rabbi, he should have been home polishing his fingernails or something. But he appears on the scene, and he heard this story. Now, this is important. He heard this story about this odd pool of water. And while he listened to this account of the water, he was also looking around. Scoping out the environment. Being aware of his social surroundings. And what did he see? Well, he saw a sea, that's S-E-A, a sea of people gathered around this pool. Some with ingrown toenails, some with strained thumb muscles, others with stiff necks from sleeping on their pillow wrong the night before. There was a crowd there, all right. And at the far corner, now this is where I get into my imagination, I imagine, Jerry, that at the far corner of the patio, at the end of the walkway, lay this 38-year. We'll call him a 38er. Can you say that, 38er? Now, I suspect that he laid at the end of this long patio. And at the end of this walkway, he was at the far end where nobody ever went because they knew there was no way out down there. They knew that he stayed at the end of the dead end. And I call it speculation, but I suspect he had a little camp there. I mean, what happened after 38 years? Don't you imagine a little camp that this guy would have? All arranged and set up, his Coleman lantern, his little tent, okay? Maybe we know he had a little mat there. He had his space carved out and his turf cleaned. And so that's the scene. And we wonder about this water's power to do what the congregation, and they were a congregation there, they were a group. We wonder about this water that the congregation reported to Jesus about. If the 38er had gotten into the water, do you think he would have been healed? That's the thing about a soap opera. It keeps you in just enough suspense to interest you. 38 years of atrophying muscles. Can you imagine now? Lame for 38 years. What would happen to your muscles? 38 years of atrophying muscles. The more this man talked, the clearer the picture became. He was a mess. He was beyond a mess. The pool of water which society had told him would make him better, had not the power to perform. That's a definition of an idol. An idol is an entity in your life that promises more than it can deliver. That is the theological definition of an idol. Whatever in your life promises more than it can deliver has become an idol. And your loyalty to that promise turns your life into a mess. Ask anyone in AA about that. Ask anyone hooked on drugs or addicted to food or anything like that. If it promises more than it delivers, it's an idol and it's leading you down a path that is a dead end. And I believe the folks around that pool knew that they could feed that rumor to this guy, and they would never have to worry about whether or not he would test out the rumor. He was lame. This whole scene was lame, Jerry. But they told me, if ever I could first get into the water, he said, I could get better. Rumor has it that if I could be whole if I ever came in first. My gosh, I think this is an American story. Rumor has it, I've been told that if I could ever come in first, I'd be better. I'd be whole. I'd be healed. You know, it's easier to believe superstition than it is to change. There's a part of this story that is based on superstition. This phantom spirit. Magic water. You know what happened, don't you? The wind blew sometime when somebody was in there with a sunburn, and their sunburn got better. Superstition. And then they expanded it to the point where whoever gets in there not only gets their sunburn cured, but everything else you want in there. I mean, this is how superstitions, even in the church, get started. It behooves any person or any group trying to better themselves, trying to change, to understand the evolution of superstitions in a group. Superstitions begin in the church with an incident of description. Superstitions develop in your family or in your workplace. And they begin with an incident of superstition. Undoubtedly, someone about 40 years ago, before this guy arrived, had gotten to the water and found some bettering effect for the water. One day, coincidentally, the wind blew while someone was infected with an eye infection. And while they were in the water and the wind blew the water, some of the water splashed up into that person. You go where I'm going here. Some of the water splashed up into that person's eye. And the water washed out the infection. And holy cow, the description of what happened became a prescription for what must happen. When this step happens, when a description becomes a prescription, interpretation of all truth is at risk. A move in their thinking from an A to a V is a very dangerous step. An event becomes the event. A method becomes the method. The description becomes a prescription. An experience becomes the experience. And then the prescription, when that happens, I mean, you're talk about a slippery slope, you're on it. You know? Then the prescription becomes a tradition. You've heard the story about the Christmas ham, haven't you? The younger generation cook cut off the end of the Christmas ham and baked the ham, and somebody asked her, well, why did you cut off the end of the ham? I think I'm getting right. There's only about 100 versions of this story. And she said, well, I don't know why I always cut off the end of the Christmas ham before I put it in the oven. She says, I'll ask my mom. Mom, why do we in our family cut off the end of the ham before we bake it at Christmas time? And my mom says, well, when you were growing up, I had such a small oven that I had to reduce the size of the Christmas ham, and we've just always cut off the end of it. When the prescription becomes a tradition, and then the tradition becomes a superstition. Superstitions truncate faith. Superstitions kill creativity. Superstitions stop change. This man would never have changed, never gotten better, never moved from his comfort zone if Jesus had not challenged and confronted the superstitions in that whole congregation and operating forcefully in that man's life. The remedy for overcoming superstitions is a questioning spirit from an outsider. This was one of Jesus' primary roles and purposes in the Judaism and the religion of his day, was to come as an outsider and question everything. And the people didn't like that about him. And they won't like it about you. You know that, where you work, where you go to school, even where you go to church, even where you worship. Why do we do it like that? I'm the outsider here. I just came in. Annie and I have been here about 7 or 8 weeks, and we have a lot of questions about the traditions in this church. But we're outsiders, you know. And sometimes if outsiders ask too many hard questions, you know what happens to them, Joel? They wind up on a cross. So Jesus comes on the scene here as a Savior, an outsider, a stranger. Because you know they had their own rules around that pool. They have their own culture. They have their own ways of doing things. And Jesus just shows up one day and turns the apple cart over around the pool. Do you want to be healed? Is it possible that many of us are sick, not because circumstances are always stacked against us, but because deep down inside, we really don't want to change, to be healed, to have something new come into our life? Maybe there are benefits in not getting into the pool first. Maybe there are benefits. And Jesus knows that there are benefits. And He wants us to know that He knows there are benefits to not getting into the pool first. And if that be the case, then the question just leaps off the page with relevance. For instance, continued sickness is not a bad way to punish yourself. Continued sickness is not a bad way to make atonement. We carry so much guilt, so many feelings of inferiority. We carry so much greed. We didn't do this right. We didn't have what it takes. We'll never be good enough. We really deserve to be beaten down and stuck. This man was stuck. Where are you stuck? So we might live with our paralysis, kind of a quid pro quo. Be sick for 38 years, be saved at the end. I can live with that. That's man-made atonement, though. It's almost as if we're saying, maybe unconsciously, give me my paralysis and I'll pay my own way. This man was in a mess. And he'd been in the mess for so long that he didn't even know, Doc, that he was in a mess. Don't get me started on what I learn about people being a hospital chaplain. One of the things that applies here is that people accept for normal the most absurd things. That's what had happened here. This man had accepted his paralysis and the whole culture as normal. This is the way the world is. And when Jesus came into his life and challenged his sense of this is what is normal, it was revolutionary. I hear the most absurd stories from families in my hospital ministry about what has become normal in families. You wouldn't believe it. That's what is happening here. Or look at the question another way. Yonder, out at the sheep gate and beyond the pool of Bethesda, there's a marketplace. It teems with people coping as best they can with life. They drive their caravans. Their camels spit at them. They haggle with tax collectors. They make some shackles. They lose some shekels. They make some shekels. They lose some shekels. We hope they lose some shackles. They gain some prominence. They suffer some shame. They struggle with the sweat on their brow of everyday life. That's what their life is like. But who expects that of a paralytic? Nobody expects success from a paralytic. And nobody expects failure from a paralytic. Climb the ladder of success? How? With paralyzed feet? Not bad. Not a bad way to live. Very low expectations. Out from under all of that, and with a good excuse for it, and with sympathy for dessert. And so the question presses upon us from Jesus. Do you want to be healed? Really healed? Even when it means being jostled in the marketplace of life? Well, maybe, but I've seen what life does to people out there. I feel pretty good laying here, laying around. Or a further possibility. A 38-year illness can be a clever way to manipulate. Some, by mournful voice and soulful gaze, turn weakness into a claim for attention. They exert unusual power over healthy people. Turn weakness into a sick advantage. Prey on the sympathies of good Christians. Gain attention for their plight. Demonstrate what someone called the tyranny of goodness. Amazing, isn't it? The use of paralysis. I mean, enough that to escape from paralysis is not a self-evident truth or possibility. This probing question aimed to penetrate our defenses, waiting for a deeper answer. Because all of the questions of Jesus have a shallow dimension and have a terribly awful spiritual dimension. Well, suppose you say yes. Suppose you say yes. What can Jesus do for you? What would the miracle be for you in your life in terms of healing and change? Suppose you say yes this morning and really mean it. What could Jesus do for you? What would the miracle be in your life? A private one or a public one? Well, I can't really answer that in advance. There are no cliche answers for what healing looks like in your life. Every cure is specific as every illness wherein you are stuck. But hear this good news this morning. Jesus reaches to those who are well defended. Jesus reaches right through your resistance. Hear the good news. I don't like this guy because he didn't meet any of my criteria for being worthy of grace. You know? At some point I'm expecting the guy to say, yeah, I want to be healed. He doesn't even do that. He deflects the question. Do you want to be healed? Well, I don't have anybody to help me into that water. That's not the answer to that question. It's a closed question. Yes or no? Do you want to be healed? Well, you equivocate about it. You don't deserve the healing power of Jesus in my theology. No, that's not who Jesus was in this story. The good news is that Jesus reaches right into your reluctance for change and invites you and encourages you and prompts and promotes the kind of change that he knows you really want but fear so desperately. That's good news. Oh my. Now the palate in the story. This is highly important and symbolic. I can't give it all the attention it needs. But the pallet represented this man's comfort zone, his status quo. You can imagine he had his little campsite there. all that goes into that. You know, people bringing him stuff. You know, he was kind of like just so dependent on everybody. And that became normal for him. His palate. When he picked up this pallet at the end of the story, he was challenged to participate in his own healing. When he picked up his pallet, he was challenged with the possibility that he would never go back to the pool. No going back. None of this sentiment about how great life used to be. Well, if worse came to worse, maybe he thought, I can always return to the way I was. No. Because when Jesus meets you and invites you, you can never go back to the way your life was. He's picking up his pallet. It tells us that our own healing might be within reach of a not too extraordinary faith. Perhaps it's only your mindset that prevents you from being healed. The pallet. Can't you see him? I mean, I wonder what kind of tracks there were there, or what kind of imprints there were there from all of his stuff. And his palate might have been sunk into the dirt there a little bit, and it might have been down and then pretty much embedded, an embedded way of being in the world. When Christ comes to you with grace to bounce you out of your stuckness into a new life, sometimes you only have to want it a little bit. And He's good enough to bring you far along. Amen. O love that will not let me go.